Welcome, Edward. It's not every day that a historian writes a page turner, so it's really good that you can join us. Just a little bit of background on Edward. Edward has a PhD in history in French history from UCL. And before we kick off, I read in the acknowledgements of your book that you were babbling on about Maximilian and Carlotta to all your friends and family. So tell us a bit about why Maximilian and how you kicked off this page turner, which I hope will be made into a movie.
Yeah, let's hope so. Well, thank you for that introduction. Well, so the PhD is actually in French and Mexican history, and it was sort of looking at the longue durée of Franco-Mexican relations in the 19th century. But central to that academic study was something, was trying to explain something that sort of captivated me since I was a teenager. So when I was doing history at school a very long time ago, and it was actually 19th century France that we did the history. And one of the figures is Napoleon III, who looms large in this book. And just as a sort of offhand remark, the teacher said, we invaded Mexico in the 1860s. And I was just shocked as a sort of 17-year-old bored in the lesson, staring out the window. I thought, did what? He invaded Mexico. And actually, I'm probably speaking to an audience here who's a bit more aware of the Cinco de Mayo and the French intervention in Mexico in the 1860s. But almost everyone that I speak to is slightly shocked and surprised to learn that France invaded Mexico. And so it was at heart really trying to explain, why that happened, how Mexicans, played their part in that, both in calling for that intervention and heroically resisting it. So it's kind of borne out a long-term fascination with the period. And then with my PhD really became obsessed with 19th century Mexico and 19th century Mexican politics, which is endlessly fascinating, or at least I think so. So what I'll do is I'll start the talk. I've got some slides, but don't worry too much about them. Hopefully I'll be able to explain what's going on. There's some text on them, but just ignore that. I'll speak for 45 minutes. I have a tendency to ramble and digress, but I shall do my best to keep myself to that. And then I'm happy to answer questions for as long as people have them. But don't feel you have to ask a question for my benefit. Right, so I will start. I'll just share my screen and then we shall begin. Hold on, sorry, wrong. Voila. So now hopefully you should have the famous painting by Edouard Manet on your screens. And this is, if people do know the story of Maximilian's Second Mexican Empire in Europe, it tends to be true. This painting is what they know. They don't necessarily know the story behind it. And of course, that's what I'm going to talk you through today. And I always like to, as I said, I came into this to explain why France invaded Mexico and why some of Mexico supported an imperialist regime that was backed by France and had the Habsburg as its emperor. And I think what I try and do in this talk is answer a question that I think Maximilian himself might well have been asking at this point, which is what on earth is a Habsburg archduke doing in a provincial city in Mexico facing a firing squad? And in order to answer that question, we have to start in Mexico, because although the book focuses on Maximilian, he's of course is executing alongside two Mexicans, and the people doing the shooting are Mexicans. So what makes Mexico, there's numerous things that makes Mexico, what makes it and unique to other Latin American republics in the 19th century, for the purposes of our story, is two things. First of all, how it becomes independent. And Mexico becomes independent as a monarchy. Agustin de Iturbide, formerly fighting for the Spanish against people who were trying to overthrow Spanish colonial rule, switches sides and is able to unite the disparate groups who are fighting against Spain behind a plan. And the plan is simple. Mexico will become independent as a monarchy and it will be ruled by a member of the Spanish royal family. Now, Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, one of the most incompetent monarchs in the entire 19th century, in my opinion, and that's a very competitive field, rejects this out of hand. He wants a complete reconquest of Mexico and refuses to countenance any kind of independent monarchy ruled by a Spanish prince. So Iturbide presented with a problem. You have a monarchy without a monarch. Its solution is simple: he crowns himself. But this is a disaster. The first Mexican Empire lasts for about 9 months. He's forced into exile and returns in 1824 in the mistaken belief he'll be welcomed as a hero. He's not. He's executed for treason, which might have served as a warning to any future attempts to restore monarchy. Now, the reason why that's important is because Mexico does become a federal republic after 1824. There's numerous attempts to reconcile factions and end the problem of 19th century Mexican politics, which is instability. Violence quickly becomes much more important than the ballot box. There are, as I say, various different attempts to resolve the instability through constitutional changes. It turns to a centralist system in the 1830s, reverts back to a federal republic. There are various authoritarian attempts to create stability in Mexico, and none of them are lasting. I mean, regimes tend to be 3-4 years max, and very, very rarely a peaceable transfer of power through election. Now, the second thing that sets Mexico apart, because of course that story of instability is not unique to Mexico in 19th century Latin America, is proximity to the United States of America. And as one later Mexican leader famously says, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States of America." And nowhere is that more apparent than in 1846, where you have this nakedly expansionist declaration of war by Washington on Mexico. It's a disaster for the Mexican army, which loses nearly every single engagement it fights. And by 1847, the United States of America unfurls the stars and stripes across the magnificent main square in Mexico City. These US troops only leave at an extortionately high price, which is that Mexico signs away half of its national territory. Today, places like California, but including parts of Arizona, all of New Mexico, and so on and so forth. So some of the wealthiest parts of the world today, previously part of Mexico, but signed away as part of a peace treaty, which is imposed upon Mexico, the price of the United States of America withdrawing its troops. And this is just a map to show you the extraordinary expansion of the US in the 19th century. Now, of course, this is a national humiliation and trauma in Mexico, and it doesn't go unnoticed in Europe either. We'll look at the European dimension in a second. Now, unfortunately for the history of Mexico, in the 1850s, you don't get any kind of unifying rallying force that brings that stability to Mexican politics that has been lacking in the first decades after independence. In fact, you have two very loose political groups, which are called parties, but it's not parties in the modern sense of the word, liberals and conservatives. And on the left, you've got Benito Juarez, the great hero of Mexican history and liberal history. Now, his argument, and the argument of his party, is that the reason why Mexico has been humiliated in the way that it has been is because it's not liberal enough. And so radical liberals sweep power in 1855, much more radical than previous governments that have been liberal. And they are looking to break the power of the Catholic Church and create a secular, much more modern, much more liberal Mexico, and drag Mexico kicking and screaming into the mid-19th century would very much be their argument. On the other hand, you have conservatives, and the man on the right of your screen, Miguel Miramon, who is also one of the men executed alongside Maximilian, has a very different version. You won't be surprised to learn. He argues that the reason why Mexico has been defeated is not because it's too liberal, it's not because it's not liberal enough, but because it is precisely too liberal already. And the only thing that binds Mexico meaningfully together as a nation state, and the only thing which will continue to foster Mexican nationalism and prevent further annexation to the United States of America, is precisely the institution that Benito Juarez and his liberals are attacking, the Catholic Church. Now, Benito Juarez, this begins as a war of words. It becomes an actual war in 1858 over the great reform project of Benito Juarez and his liberals. It lasts 3 years. Miramon nearly wins, claims that he would have won had it not been for US support for Benito Juarez and his liberal government. But Juarez wins in 1861. And there are so many moments on this story where it should end, and it should end in triumph for the Mexican nation. Benito Juarez wins elections in 1861 and becomes the undisputed president, or at least he should become the undisputed president. He doesn't. There's no loose consent. And the conservatives don't accept that results, and indeed many of them flee to Paris. At the same time, Benito Juarez's government is, of course, bankrupt. I mean, this has been a perennial problem for Mexican regimes throughout the decades after independence. In fact, only one government ever manages to balance the books in that period from 1821 to 1867. As an emergency measure, Benito Juarez suspends foreign debt payments. Now, most of this debt is owed to Britain. And in the mid-19th century, the way to get the Royal Navy at your doorstep in sort of equivalent of almost instantaneously, or however long it takes to sail there, is to not pay your debts to Britain. And particularly as Palmerston happens to be the Prime Minister, one of the more, certainly someone who you definitely don't want to renege on your debts to. Now, why so far this story isn't that dissimilar to, again, to lots of other examples of Latin American countries, not paying their debts and limited military intervention. So why does this then become an extraordinary example of regime change? Well, it's because after that defeat in the Civil War, when Mexican conservatives refused to accept the result and Benito Juarez as president, many of them flee to Paris, where they have the ear of one of the most powerful people in the world at the time, Napoleon III. So very briefly, who is Napoleon III? He is the nephew of the more famous Napoleon. He comes to power in 1848, the same year in which Mexico signs away half of its national territory. He's swept to power after revolutions break out in France. He's actually democratically elected. He's the first ever elected president of France, happens to be a Bonapartist, because a republic is declared in France. Now, Napoleon's problem is that the constitution of the republic prohibits him standing for a second term. And if any one of you know your Bonapartist history, he does what any self-respecting Bonapartist would do. He launches a coup d'etat against his own government in 1851, revises the constitution, and then a year later proclaims himself Emperor of the French, and he's restored his uncle's empire. This is where the famous Marx quote comes from: the first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. But actually in the 1850s, there's nothing farcical about this French regime. It's authoritarian, yes, but what he does is he actually governs, he uses mass democracy. There are elections to the National Assembly, but there's also plebiscites or referendums. And so he's something of a visionary when it comes to manipulating mass politics. Now, he's not stupid enough, unlike more recent politicians, ever to hold a referendum that he's going to lose. And these referendums, you have over 7 million people in France voting to absolve him, in his own words, of his coup d'etat. So use of mass democracy is innovative. He also has a very successful foreign policy. He ends France's isolation. He wins against Russia in the Crimean War, allying with Britain, and in 1859 defeats the Austrians in Italy. So he seems to restore France to glory in foreign policy, domestic stability, which is as much a problem for France as it was for Mexico in some respects. And the final thing is the economy booms in the 1850s. And this doesn't go unnoticed in Mexico. And Mexican conservatives see this, this what seemingly new model of mass participatory democracy, backing conservative ideas, creating stability through authoritarian government. And of course, what Napoleon III did in 1851 is he ends a republic and creates a monarchy. So we think today, well, how absurd and ridiculous to try and replicate that in Mexico. But for him, and indeed for Mexican conservatives, they think, well, perhaps this is a model that can can work in Mexico. In agreement with Britain and Spain, Napoleon, I should just say, he's also, through Eugenie, his wife, the Empress, who is Spanish, Mexican conservatives have a sympathetic and very Catholic ear. And it's through her that they are able to put their idea to Napoleon III. And the Mexican conservative idea is simple. To restore Mexico to greatness, you need to go back to the original plan of independence. That plan was monarchy. And therefore, all that Napoleon III needs to do to get the benefits of colonialism to France at a fraction of the cost is just to send a few thousand troops. They will be welcomed as liberators. Mexican monarchists will flock to the French banner. Benito Juarez might claim to be a liberal, he might claim to be popular, but he is actually a despot and he's oppressing a silent majority of Catholic Mexicans who hate Benito Juarez and his liberal project. So that's the pitch to Napoleon III. And he jumps at the opportunity because he has his view of Mexico is that it's fabulously wealthy. There'll be business contracts that will accrue to France, and it will radiate French power throughout Latin America. Of course, rolling back republicanism is something that the Bonaparte is always happy to be at the forefront of. And Napoleon III is absolutely aware that the rise of the United States of America is to the detriment of realpolitik European interests. And there's a fantastic quote from one of his advisors, a guy called Charles Dupin, not to be confused with the counter-guerrilla leader who served in Mexico. And he's a statistician, and he's crunched the numbers. And what he says is, in the late 18th century, the population of the United States of America was 8 million. In the mid-19th century, it's 30 million. It's up to 60 odd million by the end of the 19th century. He says in the mid-20th century, it will be nearly 500 million. These people will need more land. They'll annex all of Mexico. They'll invade the rest of South America, Central and South America. And by that point, they will be so powerful, they'll be capable of enslaving the universe, his term. And that means, and he points this out to Napoleon III, they'll be able to dictate terms to European governments. Shock horror. Now, for any 19th century statesman like Napoleon III, this is absolutely shocking. So you need to prevent US expansion. And by the way, no one expects US expansion to end in the 1850s or 1860s in Mexico or in Europe. It's a trend which they think will continue. So for Napoleon III, there's lots of reasons to get involved in Mexico. Now, I've spoken for quite a long time. I haven't mentioned the man who's going to be ruling in Mexico, which I should do. So we've set up the situation in Mexico. We've got the most powerful man in Europe on board, Napoleon III. You need a monarch for a monarchy. Enter Maximilian. So Ferdinand Maximilian, he's born in 1832. He is the younger brother of Franz Joseph. And Franz Joseph becomes Emperor of Austria again in 1848, seismic year. Now, they had been very close growing up, but when Franz Joseph becomes emperor, it's very clear that their personalities show their differences, because Franz Joseph is very conservative, very rigid, believes in autocracy. Maximilian has grown up with liberal sympathies, and in fact, he's horrified by the way in which Franz Joseph cracks down on the revolutionaries who've challenged Austrian rule after the revolutions of 1848. So Maximilian, he's also much more outgoing. He's much more gregarious and in many ways much more likable than Franz Joseph. So what do you do with a younger brother who's popular and liberal? You keep him very far from power. If you're thinking William and Harry, you're probably not a million miles off. Now, having said that, so he becomes commander-in-chief of the Austrian Navy, which is a joke. Although he actually loves the Navy, he's really into it, he's very happy to be appointed to that position. Austria is not a great naval power. So this is giving us, this is a way of, and also he's based in Trieste, which is quite far from Vienna. So although Maximilian, it's not quite the insult that it might have been, given that Maximilian really embraces it and is a very competent commander of the Austrian Navy, actually. It's very much a position that keeps him away from Vienna and away from power. Now, if every Harry needs their Meghan, if we're going to continue that analogy, and enter Princess Charlotte, better known to Mexican history as Carlotta. She is she's a formidable woman. Maximilian is convinced of his destiny to rule, and Napoleon III is convinced of his destiny to rule, and Benito Juarez, in many respects, is also convinced of his destiny to liberalize Mexico. So we've got lots of characters here convinced of their destiny, and Carlotta is absolutely one of them. She's precociously talented. I'll bring this slide up because it's just a quote, which I'll read out to you. She's talking about her studies, her schoolwork, and she writes, when I try to reason with myself, it makes no sense. It's very wicked of me to be so little grateful towards God for all the spiritual and material blessings he has given me. The only thing I want is what I cannot have, which proves that I must have a very twisted mind. I cannot conquer my laziness, and I fall so easily making resolutions which I cannot keep. Whatever efforts I make, I never seem to improve, and the effort itself is fatiguing. It is terrible to be so easily discouraged. Now, the reason I have that quote up there is because she wrote that when she was 12 years old, which is remarkable self-reflection for a 12-year-old who's falling behind in their studies, I always think. And she has a pragmatic, determined intelligence, and she adds steel to Maximilian's ambition. Maximilian is a dreamer who dreams of ruling, but perhaps never will. Carlotta is someone who brings steel and practical application to that ambition, so she's absolutely crucial in this story. Now, she is the daughter of the Belgian king, Leopold I, and as an aristocratic woman in the 19th century, to play a meaningful political role, she needs a marriage. And Maximilian breezes into the Belgian court on a diplomatic mission, and she's instantly taken. She's read a huge amount. Her favorite subjects are Plutarch and religion, even as a teenager. And Maximilian's very well read, but he's also well traveled. He's charming, he's good looking. As Queen Victoria says, he's good looking apart from the mouth and the chin. Which for a Habsburg tends to be a problem. But Queen Victoria falls back on that time-honoured tactic. We've probably all done it, praising his personality. Maximilian is wonderful. He's very personable. He's someone who's easy to get on with. Carlotta marries him very quickly, but a condition of that marriage her father imposes is that Franz Joseph must finally give him a meaningful position in the empire, in the Austrian Empire. So Franz Joseph makes him governor of Lombardy, Venetia. Again, sounds impressive, and it is. It's a really rich part of the Habsburg Empire, but it's a hotbed of sedition and Italian nationalism. It's a poison chalice. He's set up to fail. Real power remains in Vienna, and he's, in fact, in 1859, France invades northern Italy. Chaos ensues. Maximilian is sacked, humiliated by Franz Joseph, who in turn is humiliated by France because France defeats Austria. And Franz Joseph is forced to sign a peace treaty, very disadvantageous peace treaty with Napoleon III. So in 1861, Maximilian and Carlotta are underemployed, both very ambitious. Maximilian has thrown himself into the life of a dilettante. He loves botany, he loves natural science, he's a passable poet, a sort of German romantic figure. And architecture, he loves architecture, as we'll see when he gets to Mexico and landscape gardening. And he builds this fairy tale castle, which is on your screen, and there's a gratuitous picture of me visiting the castle. Now, you would have thought that life in this magnificent castle would have been fairly pleasant, but Carlotta said that Maximilian would be nothing more than a glorified janitor who occasionally traveled. More than that, she says that I have too little known life not to desire something to love and to strive for. And she could not bear to be without activity. I need to act. And the one I think that really hits home is when she's writing later, but she's writing to she's in Mexico. And she says that what stretched ahead of them in Europe was infinite boredom, staring out to sea until they died of old age. And, you know, if your partner says that to you, it's not a recipe for a happy marriage, is it? So Maximilian, I say, he dreams. He's a Habsburg. He thinks of himself, you know, he fantasizes about being a great medieval emperor. We probably all would if you were a Habsburg. Carlotta is the one who is saying, you know, we need to, if we can make that happen today, then we should do it. So when this offer comes in 1861 from Mexican conservatives first, and then from Napoleon III, they jump at the opportunity. And of course, both of those parties, Mexican conservatives and Napoleon III, completely misrepresent the situation in Mexico because they're desperate for them to accept. So they do accept, and very quickly, by January 1862, just as French forces are sailing into Veracruz, the principal Atlantic port of Mexico, Maximilian accepts the Mexican crown, so to speak, which of course is not the Mexican conservatives to offer because it doesn't exist, it's imaginary. But that doesn't matter because Napoleon III has said that it will be very easily accomplished, and he's basing that on what the Mexican conservatives have said, which is also that will be very easy to accomplish. Now, Napoleon III has only sent 6,000 troops to Mexico, right? So that gives you an indication of how easy he thinks this is going to be. It's not entirely ridiculous, though, that he could accomplish it with that number of troops, because the US expeditionary force that fights its way up exactly the same land route to Mexico City is about 14,000 max. So Napoleon III has sent half that, but what he thinks he has, which the United States of America definitely didn't have, is allies, the defeated Mexican conservatives, some of whom still have armies in the field, and they will rally to the French flag, and therefore it will be something of a victory parade for the French army rather than hard fighting. Now that doesn't happen. The Mexican conservatives, there are some undefeated who might join with the French, but they're not willing to flock to the banner of the invaders until it's clear that they're going to win. Right? They're quite tactical about it. And of course, most of the Mexican people don't rally to the flag of a foreign invader, but to the Republic of Benito Juarez, the constitutional president. So the French army makes its way towards Mexico City, but it has, in order to get there, has to take Puebla, the second city of Mexico at this time. And you can see it there, again, should be on the screen. And this is the famous battle of Puebla, the first battle of Puebla, Cinco de Mayo. So the French commander is confident. Remember, this is the army that has defeated the Russians in the Crimea, defeated the Austrians in 1859, and has crushed brutally resistance in Algeria to French colonial rule. And so he launches a frontal assault on the city, which is guarded by roughly about the same number at this stage, actually. So the Mexicans they outnumber the French in terms of the forces that they could bring to bear on Puebla, and they do after a few days of fighting, but not on the 5th of May. Wave after wave of French infantry attacks are cut down by the heroic resistance of the Mexican army, and the French commander is forced, after launching its third futile attack, to retreat. But he's lost about 10% of his army in Mexico, and so it's a fighting retreat. They make their way back towards the coast. Again, a moment where the story should end, right? Because Napoleon III undertook this mission because he thought it would be simple, it would be easy. It's proved to be the opposite of that. The Mexican nation has rallied, the Mexican army has defeated the French army. And it's worth bearing in mind, for a European army to be defeated outside of Europe is a very rare event in the 19th century. But of course, Napoleon III, his whole regime is based upon this idea of the glory of the Bonapartist myth, right? So the French army is engaged, its honor is engaged, far from retreating, withdrawing, which the British and the Spanish have done, by the way, very sensibly. He sends reinforcements. So by the end of 1862, you've got about 30,000 French troops in Mexico. It still takes them, a year after that defeat to take Puebla, another few months to take Mexico City. And it's not until 1864 that Maximilian eventually arrives in Mexico City to take up. In May 1864, he gets to Veracruz, and then in June, he's in Mexico City. That's 3 years after he's been offered the crown. And it's an incredibly dramatic moment as they voyage across from Europe. It takes about 6 weeks from Trieste to get to Veracruz. And on the 28th of May, as the Novara, the ship that Maximilian sailed to Mexico on, Veracruz hones into view, and Maximilian Carlotta surveying Veracruz, expecting cheering crowds and banners and the dream that they've been sold. And the docks are near deserted, just curious onlookers, sort of milling about on the docks. And now there's two reasons for this. Partially it's because Veracruz was the seat of Benito Juarez's government, and so there's not a huge amount of love as the Mexican army, alongside Mexican conservatives, overturns the legitimate government of Mexico. The second reason, and I slightly sympathize, is because I'm terrible at admin myself, is that the organizing committee have got the day wrong, and so they are actually not there on time. And so Maximilian Carlotta, they can't even disembark the first day that they arrive in Mexico, because by the time the organizing committee get their act together, it's too late. And so they're rowed in the next morning in the sort of twilight of dawn to empty streets of Veracruz at 5 a.m. And no cheering crowds, nothing. So it's a particularly ominous beginning. Now, the journey does improve as they get to Mexico City, partially because it's orchestrated, but also because those conservatives who do back this project of overturning monarchy come out in force. And remember, Benito Juarez is not defeated; he's retreated northwards. But die-hard liberals and the liberal army have retreated with him. So those remaining in Mexico City, particularly amongst high society and the elite, are very welcoming of Maximilian Carlotta, and there are various lavish balls and so on and so forth. So although Carlotta nearly is in tears at Veracruz, by the time she gets to Mexico City, she thinks that the monarchy is possible. That's a good question to ask. Is it possible? She thinks so, and so does Maximilian, and of course so does some of the imperialistas, as his supporters are known. Three major problems, though. The first and foremost is the resistance of Benito Juarez. As I said, he's not defeated; he's retreated northwards, and there's essentially now two governments. Mexico, and the Civil War is raging brutally. The second problem is the United States of America. Now, I should have said the only reason any of this can happen is because the United States of America is torn apart by its own civil war, and therefore unable to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, which was designed specifically to stop this kind of European intervention in the internal affairs of a Latin American nation state, especially one that happens to be on the border of the United States of America. But Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Sherwood, they are terrified that if they antagonize France, then France may become involved in the Civil War. So the hostility of the United States of America is a second problem, but temporarily that's not as serious as it's going to become later. And the third problem is the way in which Napoleon III has orchestrated this regime change. It's what we might today call a leverage buyout. He has put the entire cost of having the 30,000 French troops in Mexico onto Maximilian's treasury. And in order to pay for the immediate expenses of Maximilian's government, a loan has been raised on the money markets of Paris and London, thereby burdening Maximilian's government with debt which it will never be able to pay, quite frankly. And of course, this entire intervention, the pretext for it was Benito Juarez's suspension of foreign debt. So, putting more debt onto Maximilian's treasury is not very helpful. So he's got these three major problems. In order to overcome them, you would need a man of extraordinary ability, and that is not Maximilian. As I said, he's not incompetent, and often he is depicted as incompetent. Right? He reformed the Austrian Navy very effectively. He was a good governor of London, but he is not a man of extraordinary abilities by any stretch of imagination. He is also a man who loves procrastination. He loves delay. He loves committees. He's always setting up committees to sort out the finances, committees to look at education. He also loves arts, which is great. He sets up an Academy of Arts and Sciences. He sets up museums and things like that. And he's always proudly writing to Napoleon III, saying, look at my education reforms, which is enormously frustrating for Napoleon III because he's not interested in the reforms to Mexican education. What he wants is the finances organized and the country pacified. The French word for the brutal counterinsurgency that is resulting in the deaths of thousands of Mexicans. So Maximilian is not necessarily the man to put at the forth, to the situation. And the other problem is the French army in Mexico. I mean, it's this. I've got the man up there, Charles Dupin. He sets up a counter-guerrilla unit because the Juaristas, they control much of the countryside, hit and run tactics, and the French do what they learned in Algeria, which is brutal tactics, torture, execution, and so on and so forth. And Dupin, he will burn down a village for suspected collaboration, etc. Give you, he's an adventurer. He was in the Second Opium War. He comes into Mexico because he's experienced of these kind of imperial wars. He writes to his niece, "What an atrocious war I have waged. If I were Mexican, what hatred I would have for the French and how I would make them suffer." Now, who writes that to their niece? I mean, this is extraordinary level of sort of blasé that he has towards violence, right? I mean, you can imagine sort of writing that letter to your niece, and you can imagine what he was actually up to in Mexico. To use the language that no doubt would be used today, hearts and minds are not won over to Maximilian's regime by having people like Dupin in charge of the counter-guerrilla forces. So much so that Maximilian actually sends him back. He insists that he goes back to France because Maximilian is sort of horrified by the accounts that reach him about what Dupin and his ilk are doing. But getting rid of Dupin doesn't stop the tactics of the French army. In fact, he comes back, and extraordinarily, when the Minister of War reads what he's been doing in Mexico, he's just basically says that's what you should do, sends him back to Mexico. So that backfires on Maximilian as well, which sort of shows his impotence in relation to the French. What Maximilian does have going for him, though, is he is charismatic, and in person, he's able to win over a number of Juaristas. I mean, these are people who fought against the conservatives in the Civil War, who fought against the French intervention, who Maximilian meets in person and wins them over, and some of them serve in high positions in his regime. So he is charismatic, he is able to win people over. And the extraordinary thing about Maximilian, much to the annoyance and disgust of his conservative allies, he's a liberal, and he actually confirms pretty much the entire secular liberal reform program of Benito Juarez and his supporters, which causes him enormous problems with his own backers, the Conservative Party. But Maximilian, he is a moderate liberal. He's also a pragmatist, and had the Conservatives been able to implement what they wanted to do, namely the returning church property to the Catholic Church, overturning the requirements of reforms, they would have done it, right? So there's a pragmatic element to this as well. Now, ignore that one. That's Maximilian being offered the crown. Maximilian sets himself up at Chapultepec, turns it into the imperial, residence by excellence at great expense. He brings over, fine china, crystal, chandeliers, champagnes, etc. And it has all of these incredible balls that Carlotta orchestrates, because Maximilian actually doesn't like balls and parties. He likes to go to bed at 9 p.m. every night. So, but Carlotta, she really enjoys the pomp and the pageantry. Of course, his enemies criticize him for this. It's expensive. It contrasts very badly with Benito Juarez's austere republicanism. But, monarchy is about outward appearance. And Maximilian is obsessed with etiquette. He spends a lot of time on the voyage over writing a 600-page guide to etiquette, which again, his critics say is ridiculous. But he would say, well, you're going to set up a court. People need to know what they're doing and when, and the hierarchy, so on and so forth. cut a long story short, although by mid-1865, the empire is at its greatest territorial extent in terms of what Maximilian actually controls, there's a turning point, which is the end of the US Civil War. Now, Benito Juarez has held out heroically, and even in the face of many of his own supporters asking him to resign. His former foreign minister says, "You will not defeat the combined forces of Mexican imperialistas and the French army." And Maximilian has confirmed all of the reforms that we were fighting for, so there is no point fighting on. Benito Juarez has made a sterner step on that and refuses to come to any accommodation. He holds out long enough that the United States of America is able to bring pressure on France to withdraw. That's because the US Civil War ends in April 1865, the Union defeats the Confederacy, and now you have the United States of America with an army which is the largest that it's ever been in US history, a veteran army on the border of Mexico that would be able to invade at a moment's notice. Now there are Mexicans within the United States of America supporting Benito Juarez, famously Tez Romero, who is a diplomat. He's actually urging the United States of America to do this, to invade and kick the French out. The Secretary of State, William Sherwood, realizes that it's not necessary to do so. All you need to do is pressure Napoleon III to withdraw his troops. He knows that it's very unpopular in France. He knows that Maximilian's government is in all kinds of trouble. And he knows that the last thing that Napoleon III can afford is a war with the United States of America. So the threat of it is going to be more serious than any actual military intervention on the point of the United States of America. So in December of 1865, Sherwood essentially issues an ultimatum to France: get your troops out of Mexico or it's war. Napoleon III has been looking for a pretext to get out anyway, because it's turned into exactly what he wanted it not to be, which is another Algeria, tying down 30,000 French troops for decades, costing hundreds of millions of francs. Meant to be paid for by Maximilian. He writes to Napoleon III and says, "Those payments that I agreed to make, unfortunately, I can't make them. But obviously we're friends, so it doesn't matter. Can you just give me some credit?" And that's the pretext that Napoleon III uses to withdraw his troops in January of 1866, using language remarkably reminiscent of recent Western interventions. He declares mission accomplished, Mexico is pacified, and therefore our troops can come home because the regime that we have created is consolidated. Of course, he knows that's not true, but it's for public consumption in France. Now, when Maximilian hears that Napoleon III, who he considers as his friend, who has written him several letters saying, "My support will never fail you," is about to pull the plug on French military and financial assistance, he decides to abdicate. He says, "Well, if they don't want me here, I will return to Europe." Carlotta is furious. She tells him that it is cowardice, that as there is an emperor, there will be an empire, even if no more than 6 feet of earth belong to him. And she says that even kings in the Middle Ages at least waited for people to come and take their states away from them, i.e., you've been fighting. There's no way you should return to Europe. And you can read, even reading her, she writes a 10-page memorandum about why it would be cowardice to abdicate. And I think I could see why Maximilian is terrified into staying. She was a very forceful woman. And she's got a plan as well. She says, "I'll go to France. I will remind Napoleon III of his promises, and I will persuade him to continue to keep the French army in Mexico." So she travels back in the summer of 1866. And now I have some sympathy with Napoleon III here. He desperately tries to avoid this meeting. No one likes to be reminded of their foreign policy mistakes, but Carlotta is eventually so determined that she sets up a meeting. She has the letters that Napoleon III has written saying, "My support will never fail you," which she's written to Maximilian. And she presents the letters to Napoleon III. And Napoleon III starts crying, breaks down, tears, but he doesn't change his mind. Carlotta has failed in her mission. Now she's got one last attempt to try and get European support. And this is to go to the Vatican. So remember that Maximilian has confirmed all of the reforms of Benito Juarez, particularly in relation to church-state relations and the nationalization of church property confiscated in the 1850s. So he's essentially become anathema to his key core conservative constituent, opposing his rule, or at least not supporting it. If Carlotta can convince the Pope to give his blessing to Maximilian's reforms, that will bring Catholic Mexico back on board. So she travels to the Vatican. She has a first meeting with the Pope, which is relatively It doesn't really come to anything. There's going to be a follow-up meeting. She can't wait for that meeting. She breaks into the Vatican unannounced in early hours of the morning in I think it's early October, demands to see the Pope. She doesn't have an appointment. You need an appointment to see the Pope. She's the Empress of Mexico. What can you do? And in the corridors of the Vatican, she finds the Pope. It's sort of wandered out, slightly bemused. But instead of discussing church-state relations, she breaks down in tears, sobbing uncontrollably, crying out that Napoleon III is trying to murder her, and that her entire entourage, all of the Mexican politicians who've come with her from Mexico, are in the pay of Napoleon III, trying to poison her. So it's an extraordinarily dramatic moment, and she's completely lost all reason and had a mental breakdown. In part because of the pressure that she's put upon herself, because she's told her husband to stay in Mexico. The entire survival of the regime and potentially his life is she thinks is in her hands. And she never recovers. She's only bundled out. I mean, there's lots of, I won't go, I'm aware I'm rambling, we need to get to the end. She's eventually bundled out. She never recovers. And she lives out the rest of her life. She doesn't die till 1927 in semi-seclusion, because that was the way that doctors thought was the best way to treat these kind of paranoid delusions. And also, it's completely unaware at times of what has happened, which we must return to. So back in Mexico, oh, that's too soon. Back in Mexico, Maximilian is unaware of this. So when he first hears that France is going to withdraw support, he's very pessimistic, but buoyed by his wife's confidence and buoyed by turning back to his core constituency, the Mexican conservatives, who promise him, that they can raise tens of thousands of men, and huge amounts of money to support him, he begins to get more confident. And by September 1866, when he's celebrating Mexican independence, he thinks, that the future is bright and that the empire can continue and they'll be able to push back, the Juaristas who made considerable advances. But then when he hears about the news from Europe that Carlotta has had this breakdown, his entire universe shatters. He had come to Mexico, as he himself says at this point, I came to Mexico more for her sake than mine. I don't have any descendants, any heirs here, any natural heirs. There's a bizarre story where he kidnaps grandson to be Dave, but we won't go into that. And therefore, he just resolves to abdicate again, the second time. And this time, it's much more serious. He leaves Mexico City in October 1866. He packs up his furniture, he packs up his archive. It's all shipped off back to Europe. He's convinced that he's going to go. But as I say, he's a man who is prone to indecision and procrastination. And the conservatives begin to sort of chip away at him. They say it would be dishonorable for a Habsburg to leave his post, and that it would be cowardice, playing on his sense of honor. They also say that now that the French are withdrawing, the taint of foreign intervention is no longer with the Conservative Party. So we'll be able to, people will flock to our banner. Again, money, men will flow. The Catholic Church will support you. Key amongst these figures is Miguel Miramon, the man we mentioned earlier, once president of Mexico, to his supporters at least, leader of the Conservative Party. Maximilian had actually sent him away to observe the Prussian army in Prussia. He wanted to get him away from Mexico because he was worried about conservatives opposing his reforms. He comes back. He's something of a hero to certain parts of the Conservative Party, and so Maximilian is buoyed by his return. And once again, he's talked out of it, and he invites his councillors and ministers to vote on the issue: should I stay or should I go? They vote for him to stay. But again, it's actually what happens is 10 vote for the empire to continue, 2 vote for the empire to end, his more liberal supporters who are still part of his cabinet, and 11 vote for him to stay, but only so long as to set up a Congress which could vote on the future government of Mexico, and then he should go. But Maximilian interprets this as wholehearted support, because he says, well, I got 21 votes out of 23. It's a landslide, but it's 11 of those votes are actually contemplating the end of his regime. Anyway, you could imagine what's the state of the empire. This takes 40 days to resolve. He's out of Mexico City. Juaristas are advancing on all fronts, and Oaxaca is under siege by Diaz, in fact. And Diaz's troops are taunting the imperialistas who are defending Oaxaca, saying, well, your emperor is about to abdicate, so why on earth are you fighting? And the regime is increasingly bankrupt. They lose the ports, which is the principal point of revenue from customs, soldiers going unpaid. And by January of 1867, Maximilian returns to Mexico City, calling himself the Emperor of Mexico, even by his own sense of delusion, I think would have been slightly absurd. He controls Mexico City, Veracruz, and a few towns, which the French are still holding, which are running as kind of ribbon down to Veracruz, which their escape route, and one or two towns north of, well, I say a few more towns north of Mexico, which we'll come to in a second. So things are looking bleak. The French are still there, but they're not fighting the Juaristas. They've come to an agreement that they won't engage in an battle, because why would you want to lose your life fighting when you know that the French army is withdrawing? They leave Mexico City in February, 5th of February, 1867, and there's sort of chaotic scenes of refugees. So imperialistas, Mexicans and Europeans who've supported the empire, this is the last day that they can leave Mexico City. And the French army will guarantee their safety. So again, scenes reminiscent of fairly recent events. But Maximilian is determined to stay, and he doesn't go to this military parade as the French march out of Mexico City. He refuses to watch it, although supposedly he's on top of the National Palace, looking down at the streets as the French army go, and allegedly turns to one of his supporters and says, "At last, we are free," because by this point his hatred for the French is extreme. He feels abandoned and betrayed. What does he do with his freedom? Well, his Mexican conservative generals have got a plan. And that plan is that they will unite the disparate forces still loyal to the empire, and they will win a monumental triumph over the forces of Benito Juarez. And they'll do so at Querétaro, about 130 miles northwest of Mexico City. And the idea is, again, they completely exaggerate the level of support. They'll say, tens of thousands of men, billions of dollars, etc. None of that is true. They can't scrape more than, they can get 1,500 men to march from Mexico City to Querétaro, and they can get about 50,000 pesos, I think it is, off the top of my head, i.e., but hardly anything. They're going to go there to relieve the Imperialista army, which is regrouping. It's a stronghold of conservatism. It's so in that sense, it's not a bad place to have what will become a last stand, but in terms of its terrain and its geography, it's disastrous, because it's surrounded by hills on three sides with no plain to the west, and Maximilian has to fight his way through guerrilla attacks and when he does, he doesn't have enough men to occupy the high ground. So then the armies of Benito Juarez are three separate armies converging, and they very quickly place the city under siege. And the odds are not looking good, because the artillery can take the high ground, and the town is being shelled every day. They haven't provisioned for a long siege. They don't have the money for a long siege, and pretty soon it becomes clear that they're going to have to take decisive action. Now, it's that sort of painting it slightly worse than it was, because another one of Maximilian's conservative generals, Leonardo Marquez, who is an extraordinary figure, is actually able to break out of the siege after about 2 weeks. And he's meant to go to Mexico City, get reinforcements, come back, break the siege. And that gives confidence to Maximilian for two reasons. One, it was very easy for Marquez to break out, and therefore he thinks, well, we need to break out later, we'll be able to do the same. And also reinforcements are coming. But Marquez disobeys his orders, goes through Pueblo, is defeated, and now he himself is under siege of Mexico City by the forces of Porfirio Diaz, in fact. So it's looking bleak, and Maximilian is resolved to break out. They nearly do succeed in doing that on one attempt, and then there's the famous event, which is on the 15th of May, the final breakout, where Maximilian is betrayed by one of his formerly very loyal officers, and Juaristas are shown brought through the Imperialista lines. The Imperialista colonel Miguel Lopez, he gets the Imperialista guards to stand down, and Maximilian and his forces are surrounded. Even then, there's a last stand. He manages to get away, but eventually he is captured and surrendered to Mariano Escobedo, actually, who and there's a nice kind of contrast between Escobedo, liberal hero, general in the Juarista armies, and he's originally a farm laborer, and Maximilian, of course, born in Vienna, Habsburg prince. So he surrenders his sword to Escobedo, which is a very symbolic moment. So he he's caught, I'll just rattle through this so we can get to questions because I'm kind of going over time. He's imprisoned, and he court-martialed and then sentenced to death. And he probably would have expected to have been pardoned and sent into exile. But it was very rare for him to be executed, but of course Benito Juarez doesn't recognize Maximilian as a head of state. He's a usurper. And the example would be someone like Jefferson Davis, of course, who's committed the most egregious treason you could. He is amnestied and he's pardoned, but Benito Juarez has been fighting this conflict, as I say, against conservatives since 1858, if not before. And let's get to so you can see the execution down there, how it actually looked. But he's executed alongside Miramon and another conservative general, Mejia. And the Miramon and Mejia, they represent two different strands of conservatives in Mexico. Mejia, the pious indigenous peoples who flock to the conservative banner to defend the Catholic Church. Miramon, who's part of the Creole elite, and the sort of, not that Miramon himself actually is particularly wealthy, but with the sort of land, the landed gentry, as it were. These two kind of wings of the Conservative Party, and Maximilian representing European intervention, European monarchy. So it's highly symbolic, this execution. And it really is an attempt to draw a line under all of those three kind of strands of conservatism that Benito Juarez has been fighting against. And so Maximilian, I don't think ever had any chance of receiving a pardon. So Juarez, I think it's a foregone conclusion. Now, the Manet painting is inaccurate. Maximilian doesn't wear a sombrero. And in fact, he's not even in the middle. That's Miramon. Maximilian's on the right as the photograph looks at him, and there's a picture bottom right you can see. But I will just finish on the Manet painting, because from Maximilian's point of view, it shows the kind of calm stoicism and the honor of his death, and he was obsessed by honor. And he actually thought, I think that his last stand was slightly squalid in some respects, but he would have seen his last stand as heroic. And so he would have welcomed that truth, even if the painting is historically inaccurate. But the other thing he would welcome is that the man to the right, preparing the coup de grace, he has the conspicuous features of Napoleon III. And so the implication is clear, is that it's the French emperor who has blood on his hands. And in fact, the uniforms of the troops are wearing a model on the uniforms of the French army rather than the Mexican. And so that idea that this disastrous attempt at regime change that, Maximilian I'm not absolving him of blame, by the way. It's his hubris and arrogance is extraordinary to have accepted in the first place. But the implication that Napoleon III has blood on his hand, I think, is something that Maximilian would have welcomed. So I'll end there and then open it up to I'll hand back to Susanna and take questions.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Edward. I mean, your book really, it reads like a movable feast, and you've just sort of given us a quick snapshot of your book. I loved how you shuffle between Europe and Mexico and then back to Europe. I also love the correspondence that you uncovered between Maximilian and Carlota. I think that's very telling of their very special relationship that they had. Another thread of the book that I loved was the theme of procrastination, and how Maximilian is like busy, choosing the right curtains for Chapultepec Castle, when he has all this pressure from Napoleon III saying, hey, where's my bookkeeping? But he's too busy, making his castle look beautiful. And I just thought also the procrastination theme, it sort of followed him throughout his life. When he wants to abdicate and people say the right thing to do, he sort of dithers. So it's like we have this dithering figure. And I don't know, it just there's so many moments in your book when the one I loved is when Maximilian is fighting the Juaristas and the liberals, and they're at his tail, and there's bullets like whizzing by everywhere. And he takes a moment to look at the butterflies, and it's just incredible. So before we kick off to the questions, I just wanted to ask you, what is the most surprising thing you learned about this time in history and about Maximilian?
Yeah, thank you, Susanna. Most surprising thing I learned Gosh, I wasn't expecting that one. I'm going to have to think. Most surprising, most surprising, most surprising. Well, I think it's. I mean, it's kind of, it's as you say. Sorry, I just saw that chat. Apparently, the sound wasn't good, so I apologise. And I was probably speaking too quickly. Bit late now. Sorry though. The most surprising thing, I think. I mean, there's just so many. I think it is the absurdity of it. So I came into it, as I say, trying to explain as a historian why some in Mexico support France invades, and trying to kind of remove it slightly from the sheer kind of operatic absurdity of the story. But then, and you know, as an intellectual kind of PhD project, that's the easiest to do. But once you start doing it as a narrative, you know, trying to keep that analysis in there, but you just keep stumbling across these extraordinary vignettes, like you say, you know, the bullets whistling past as Maximilian is observing the butterflies, but also the sort of the characters that it drags in. And what I don't think I realized was quite how you know, quite the extent of European volunteers who were involved fighting for the empire, but also, you know, how it drags in people like Felix Samsam, soldier of fortune, who fought for the Union in the US Civil War, but then fights with Maximilian in the Imperialista army. And it's just stuff you can't make up. I mean, his wife is Agnes. She's a US citizen, and she, you know, but with sort of she grew up in the circus. She's this extraordinary figure to marry a Prussian princess. And then they have a dog, and that dog is called Jimmy. And they bring their dog with them on campaign. And you think, well, you know, if you were writing this as a script or as a work of fiction, they would just say, no, it's too ridiculous. Or Carlotta breaking down in the Vatican, you know, under the pressure of her mission. It's the sort of thing that if it were fiction, you'd say, well, I think it's been pushed a bit far. And just seeing that in the archives and in the sources, it's just wonderful. So
yeah, it's just so many lovely vignettes like that just bring the book alive. And, you know, as I said before, I loved it. We have a question from Ambassador John Benjamin here in Mexico City. Ambassador.
Thank you. Great to meet you, Edward. I love the book, which I only finally finished the other day. But my question is very simple. It's given my impression here that this is a chapter of history that's not that well known here nationally either, and certainly not often spoken about. When you going to get the book fully translated into Spanish? And if you do, I'd be happy to offer you a forum to launch it when you next come over here. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's incredibly kind. Thank you, Ambassador. It is actually being translated into Spanish and should be available, I think, next year. So I'll have to double check that, but it is now being translated into Spanish, which is fantastic news, and will be available in Mexico in Spanish. As I say, probably about this time next year, but I'll have to double check.
Okay, we have a question.
Well, that's an open invitation, so you let me know when the time is right.
That's extremely kind. Thank you. I most certainly will.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
And we'll have a question from Dudley next. Dudley.
Hello. Thank you very much, Edward. It was very, very interesting and very illuminating, and most grateful. My question is somewhat arcane. I read somewhere that Maximilian had a child with a daughter of the gardener in Chapultepec, and that this child, many years later, was shot as a spy, a German spy, by the French government in 1917, I think. Have you come across this rather unusual story?
I have actually. Was discussing it when with Susanna. In fact, So this is the story that he had an affair with the daughter of his gardener at Cuernavaca, which was one of his residence, sort of opulent two residences he had there. And supposedly she became pregnant and had his illegitimate son, and then she dies of a broken heart when she hears that Maximilian is dead. But then his son, who served as a diplomat, and eventually winds up being shot as a German spy during World War I. So this is one of those stories that is too good to be true, in my opinion. I'm afraid. I think that, well, first of all, the man who did the I think it's Julio Sedano, I think it's his name. He is not Maximilian's son, and you know he was born a year too early. The dates don't work, and he's, it's very clear who his parents were. So he's not the illegitimate son. And the affair, I mean, there are all kinds of rumors, as you would expect, of Maximilian having affairs. And it's very possible that he did. Whether he had an affair with the 17-year-old indigenous daughter of his gardener is, I think, that probably the kind of, so there are lots of rumors like that. And I think it's the sort of mentality of the time to attribute these things. And then it becomes a local legend as well, and that which reinforces it in Cuernavaca. I think there's a restaurant now which is named after her. And so,
yeah, Bonita.
Yeah. So I don't, I think that, well, I'm aware of the story. I don't think it's true. And with my historian's hat on, I'd say there's no documentary evidence to substantiate it, which is a rather boring answer. I apologize.
No, not at all. And thanks. You cleared it up, because I have to say, instinctively, I thought it was too good to be true. And obviously, it appears that it was too good to be true. But thank you very much anyway. It's very kind.
Thank you.
Any more questions, anyone? While we wait for more questions, I have another one for you. I grew up here in Mexico, and we were taught that Emperor Maximilian was executed. He was the aggressive foreigner who came to Mexico to impose his empire here. Why do you think there's such a gap in people's historical knowledge about Maximilian? And not just in Mexico, in Europe as well.
Well, I think in terms of Mexico, I think the first thing to say is that he is heading a project that is imperial from a European point of view, and although it is backed by Mexican conservatives, it's certainly not backed by the majority of the people in Mexico, right? So he's the sort of nicest man I think you could possibly want to head a French-backed imperial project in alliance with Mexican conservatives. But it's still, he's, I guess what I'm trying to say is he is on the wrong side of history, right? I mean, it's so that kind of interpretation of him has some element of truth. But why I caveat that is because Benito Juarez becomes this sort of unifying figure in Mexican history, not least because of the contested decades after independence. He's sort of the sort of myth that myth becomes part of Mexican officialist discourse under the Porfiriato, and indeed is appropriated by the revolution. And because the Mexican conservatives argue that Maximilian essentially betrayed them by enacting liberal reforms, you have a situation where you have no support. So if you supporters of Maximilian and his regime writing histories of him afterwards. So if you read the histories written by either members of the Mexican Conservative Party or people sympathetic to that project, they're very critical of Maximilian. And if you read the liberal histories of the period, they're also very critical of Maximilian for obvious reasons, right? So he's quite sort of he was buried until fairly recently in Mexican historiography, and there have been some brilliant scholars who've kind of Mexican scholars who've excavated the period and have kind of taken it seriously as a moment in Mexican history. Because, as I say, prior to that, even if you supported Maximilian as a Mexican, you were very keen to distance yourself from the Second Mexican Empire afterwards, and of course the liberals did as well. And so I think there was a very simplified version of it that is kind of dominant in Mexican historiography, in the kind of right view of Mexico, not looking at the complexities, the Mexican foundations of it, and so on and so forth. Why? And in Europe, it's a great question. In Europe and the United States as well. So I can sort of understand. In Europe, it gets subsumed. It's huge at the time, absolutely massive, because the execution of the Habsburg Archduke in Mexico, I mean, it's sensational, and it's not. The comparison would be today. If a member of the British royal family killed fighting in Afghanistan, it was just seismic news, shock waves across Europe. And that money painting is worth remembering that one of the reasons it's not publicly displayed is for a long time is just because it would be so shocking to see an image of a Habsburg being executed. But it gets subsumed in events in Europe that just seem bigger, like the Franco-Prussian War and the fall of Napoleon III and the rise of Prussia and German militarism. And it's almost so odd and outlandish that it's something that's, I guess, quite easy to forget. The Habsburgs, of course, end as a dynasty after the First World War. And it somehow just, it falls just through the cracks of history, and it's just not well known at all here, as I say, and often people are just shocked when I tell them. And you know, Cinco de Mayo is not an event that's well understood. I mean, in the United States of America as well, potentially, and it's very yeah. I don't actually have a good answer to why it's so little known in Europe, except as I say that it's.
I'm hoping that your book will change that, because
Yeah.
you know, in the US especially, Cinco de Mayo, it's just an excuse to drink Corona beer and have some guacamole. But just
Right.
quickly as we wrap up, I know that Richard also has a question. I have one final question, and it's about the irony that Maximilian was far more aligned with Benito Juarez and his liberals than the conservatives who brought him to Mexico. And it's just so ironic that, you know, he was quite a sort of sensitive chap, and he really had very liberal ideas. And is it true that he learned Nahuatl?
No. So Carlotta did. She tried to learn Nahuatl. Yeah, she did for 6 months, and she had an indigenous lady in waiting. Which was very shocking to, again, it's so many contradictions within it. A lot of Maximilian's supporters, both Mexican and European, found his kind of interest in indigenous culture and pre-Columbine civilization very shocking. But Carlotta did learn Nahuatl. She was a great linguist, probably spoke, they both were actually. And so they were quite interested in languages. What is true is that it was under the Second Mexican Empire, and Maximilian's government was the first post-independence regime to publish anything official in an indigenous language in Nahuatl. Yeah. And I think what's, as a Habsburg, he was used to ruling over, you know, different peoples and different ethnicities. Whereas in Mexico, certainly amongst the Creole elite, there was a tendency to see that pre-Columbine civilization as inverted commas barbaric, as in some ways not modern, and in some ways not European. And so it quite quickly came out of official government discourse after independence. Whereas Maximilian was someone who was much more comfortable embracing it, because it was in some senses not dissimilar to as I say, to having lots of different peoples under one government under the Habsburg monarchy.
Well, remarkable, really. And Richard, you have a last question.
Well, it needn't be the last question. If there are more questions, we're very happy for people to go on. My question is, what happened to Miramar? You showed that lovely picture of you standing in front of the wonderful fairy tale castle, and Carlotta went back there, but what happened after that?
Yes, I have that picture because it was taken just before the sort of pandemic was unleashed, and it was pretty much the last time that I was able to leave the UK. So it's nice just to see myself in another country. So Miramar, it's not actually entirely completed, in fact, ever. But even after, it's not till after Maximilian's death that it's all put to his kind of exacting standards. So he did the minutiae of the interior design. Remotely from Mexico, to the forerunner of home working, because it wasn't even finished when he left. And now it's almost it's a museum, but almost a mausoleum, because it's exactly how he wanted it, decked out in the colours and the coat of arms of the Mexican Empire, and also his Habsburg lineage and family. It's an absolutely wonderful place to visit. I'd recommend it. What happens to it afterwards? So Carlotta is taken care by her Belgian family. And so she's there until about the beginning of 1868, and then she's taken to Belgium. And then it just remains as a Habsburg property until that part of what's today Italy is lost to the Habsburgs after the First World War. And then rather bizarrely, it's sort of lived in by an Italian fascist in the 20s and 30s. So if you go onto the second floor of Miramar, that's still decorated and decked out as in the style of 1920s and 30s Italian fascism. So it's a bit of a contrast as you go into the second floor. And then after that, it becomes a headquarters for the US Army in the region, who are they're there because of the Cold War. And then I think it's in either the 50s or possibly the 60s, it becomes a national museum. an Italian museum, which it is today. But the gardens are beautiful, and it's worth a visit. But it also tells you a lot about Maximilian's character, because before there was nothing there. It was a barren rock. It's sort of looking out over the Adriatic, and he transforms it at enormous expense, nearly bankrupts him, into a bucolic paradise. So one, you've got the kind of profligate nature of Maximilian, just willing to spend anything on a dream, and it's this neo-Gothic medieval fairy tale castle, as you say. And the second, though, he does do it, so it shows that kind of that arrogance and that hubris, but there are points in his life where it works, and he's able to bend the world to his imagination. And it's I think that's partially why he goes to Mexico, because as Susanna says, he's completely out of step with his allies who ask him to come, his Mexican conservatives. But he has, what he would call self-confidence and belief in what I think we would call arrogance and hubris, to think that he can walk that kind of middle road between liberalism and conservatism and bring both sides on board and unite Mexico after years of civil war, with disastrous consequences. But I think Miramar does give you a bit of an insight into his mindset.
Thanks very much. For anybody who's interested, there was a program done by Monty Don on BBC television a few weeks ago, and that's probably still available on iPlayer. And he went to Miramar and showed the wonderful gardens, so it's well worth looking at. Susanna, do carry on.
Oh, I have a comment from someone in the audience who grew up near Miramar Castle and used to play there as a child, but she just had to step out, unfortunately. And then I've had another comment from someone in the audience saying, thank goodness that Maximilian came to Mexico, otherwise we wouldn't have Reforma. Can you tell us about that, Edward? Reforma Avenue, I mean.
Oh yes, so so he has grand plans for renovating. That's not the right word, a complete sort of redevelopment of Mexico City, and partially this is based on the inspiration of Napoleon III. So for those of you who don't know, the kind of Paris that you see today as a tourist is the Paris of Napoleon III, who completely redesigned and was actually involved in the redesign process to turn Paris into what would have been then a kind of modern, powerful city with wonderful monuments. The Champs-Élysées, you're right. So that's a good example. So this was Maximilian's attempt to recreate the Champs-Élysées, but also it was a way to get from Chapultepec down to the National Palace quickly. It was convenient for him. So that's the reformer. And so when Benito Juarez enters in triumph into Mexico City, is like, well, yeah, this is a good idea. We'll keep this one. Yeah, so that's definitely one of the legacies that you could.
Well, thank you, Francine Howard, for bringing that question up about Reforma Avenue. And if you'd like to speak yourself and ask any more questions, please let us know, Francine. I have another comment from Graciela. Says, thank you for a wonderful talk. Please, could you say where Maximilian's body is today?
Yeah, it's in Austria, and it's in the Imperial Crypt in Vienna, which is where sort of all Habsburgs are buried. There's a kind of macabre and slightly unfortunate kind of addendum to Maximilian's story, which is that his body is embalmed, but Benito Juarez, as I say, he's a tough politician, and he tries to use Maximilian's body as leverage. So Mexico becomes I guess what we would call a rogue state in the eyes of most European courts, because as executing our Habsburg is just shocking. I mean, it's shocking even in the United States of America, Republic. And so they break off diplomatic relations with Mexico. And one way that Benito Juarez tries to get the Austrian Empire to recognize his government is to say, we're not going to return Maximilian's body until you do so. And so it's sort of kept in rather insalubrious conditions in Mexico City for a few months. It's quite badly embalmed, and it's not till November 1867 that an Austrian admiral the body is released to an Austrian admiral. So that's what I'm terrible at dates, but good five or whatever months after he's killed is the body actually sent back to Austria in rather dilapidated state, and it lands at Trieste, and is huge crowds. He was very popular in Trieste because of his work with the Austrian Navy. Huge crowds come out to greet it then, and it's taken on by train up to Vienna. And then it's delivered to the Habsburgs and to his mother Sophie, who just breaks down in tears, crying over the coffin, as you might expect.
Oh, unthinkable. We have a question from Oscar. Oscar, you're next.
Yes, thank you, Susana. Thank you, everyone. It is a fantastic session. I have one question, Edward, about the stock market in Mexico began in 1850, more or less. And the period was very important for mining, textiles. I was always wonder about to what extent that period with Maximilian brought together more entrepreneurs from Europe and boost somehow trade that could have reflected in the growth of the stock market in Mexico, because that's something of my particular interest in that period.
Well, that was always the dream, and that was why it was so attractive to Napoleon III, right? Because there's this idea in Europe that Mexico is fabulously wealthy. It's the sort of El Dorado myth, but also Alexander von Humboldt had traveled through that, that region of Latin America and had all of these amazing accounts of the mineral wealth of Mexico, and mining, as you say, but crucial. So it was thought that the only thing that's holding Mexico back is political instability. If we bring stability and European, inverted commas, expertise and know-how and technology, then we'll be able to develop the resources of Mexico. And there'll be just phenomenal economic growth and all of this, you say, sort of financial institutions and ideas of credit, which are just being developed at that time. But the situation in Mexico is never peaceful and stable enough for any of that to be meaningfully developed. The big one that they tried to do constantly with very little success is the railway from Veracruz up to Mexico City.
Thank you.
Until the
Another
1880s.
question. We have a question from Charlie. I don't know, Charlie, do you wanna speak? You ask your question? Oh, we can't hear you.
Yeah, okay. So I think I read it in an Excelsior newspaper that in the 1970s, an Austrian woman returned to Austria with a box that she knew where it had been hidden in the Borda Gardens in Cuernavaca, and it contained jewelry that belonged to Maximilian and Carlotta. And she left on a diplomatic passport, so her luggage was not inspected, and received a medal from the Austrian government upon returning this. It would mean that the Austrians knew where the stuff had been for over 100 years and waited for the opportunity.
Wow. I don't know that story, but I'm sure. I mean, yeah, they definitely a lot of the personal effects of Maximilian and Carlotta would have, they wouldn't have made it back to Europe and would have stayed, in various places in Mexico. But that's a great story. I don't know that one. Interesting.
Any more questions? If not, I have one on. While you think of questions, everyone, I want to ask you about this special relationship between Carlotta and Maximilian, and how Carlotta really sustained Maximilian, emotionally, psychologically, really sort of was his rock.
Mm-hmm.
And it's ironic that she's the one who ends up, crazy even before he's executed. So what happened there? Yeah,
so she, as I say, she's really gives steel to his ambition. He's a dreamer, and in many ways quite impractical. She is pragmatic. She much better understands the situation in Mexico, and in fact, it's quite telling. So Maximilian, one other of his criticisms from actually probably from even his supporters, was that he was a royal tourist. He loved going on tour of the kingdom and seeing different parts of Mexico. And he would be away for 2-3 months, at a time. And of course, the French would be saying, you need to sort out the finances, there's all these problems, why are you going on tour, etc. And so when he was on tour, Carlota was ruling as regent, and the change in how the kingdom is governed is marked both by the Mexican ministers and also by the French. So the Mexican ministers are astonished because when they have cabinet meetings with Maximilian, they just debate, issues, and they sort of talk in pleasantries and they talk for hours, but nothing is ever decided. But Carlota, she would read up about the issue, she would come up with her proposals, and she would present them to the ministers. So there would be no discussion. She would just say, this is what I think, this is what we're doing. And so, very different style, very decisive. And the French as well. Her mother was French, which helped, but the French, one of the French generals said, everything would have worked out fine if Carlota had been the emperor. Basically, that she was just much better at it than he was. But of course, she had to play a subordinate role. Their relationship it's interesting, and it's on a political level, it works very well. Their correspondence is really touching, and remains so right up until Carlota has a breakdown, and then it kind of breaks off. And I think that I think they loved each other. I think that they did have the issue. Children was an issue, that Maximilian wanted heirs, and I think that who knows whether it was him. So the legend is that he does have illegitimate children. That's not true. For whatever reason, they can't have children. I think that caused problems, and there are loads of rumors of well, I say loads. There's a lot of rumors of affairs. I'm not a biographer. You'd have to drill down more into it. My instinct is, well, you just never know. I think sorry, I'm rambling again. The point at which it would have been very easy for him to have affairs is the point at which his wife goes mad and is no longer in Mexico. And there are no rumors of affairs after Carlota's gone. The rumors are always when she's there, and it tends to be gossip. It's gossipy from memoir servants, whatever. There's no actual evidence that he's regularly meeting people. There's no correspondence with his mistress or anything like that. So I'm inclined. My feeling is that whatever the case with the affairs, it was a relationship based on mutual respect, love, and was politically worked very well for them. And I don't really buy the affairs, but there are plenty of rumors that there were there. Yeah, it was, and he was absolutely devastated, when he found out what had happened.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating, and I can imagine just getting really into this. Are you going to write a sequel, or what's your next project?
Yeah, I'm working on a few ideas, but I think probably next I'm going to switch focus and look at Napoleon III in France and see what he was up to.
Fantastic. Well, we have a lot of people here in Mexico, and especially in Cuernavaca, where the Jardín Borda is situated. I don't know if you went there. Does anyone from any of my Cuernavaca people, do you have any questions, or anyone else? Francine in Mexico City.
I think selfishly, I'd love to know whether you might come and do a talk or at least on Zoom for my children's school, the Wingate School, which I might be able to touch base with you, Susanna, to see afterwards. But that would be wonderful. I think this is really important for general knowledge really of history of Mexico and these important people. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, thank you for coming. Well, anyone else? Well, look, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Edward. Richard had to step away. He had something else to go to. But yeah, just to say, fantastic work, Edward. Really loved your book. I hope everyone reads it. I hope it's made into a film. And yeah, I hope that a lot of school children, like Francine's kids, get to hear this history. It's just fascinating the way that you present the book, and just, massive congratulations.
Thank you. That's such a so many kind words, and thank you so much everyone for listening. I know it's been long, and I probably talked too quickly and too quietly, but it was a real honor to be asked to do this talk, and fantastic to see so many people listening and talking about the book and this endlessly fascinating period of history. I know everyone's going to go off now and research the illegitimate
Yes. Well, Susanna, thank
Children
you
of
very
Maximilian. Well, I didn't tell you the rumor that he didn't die as well. So
yes. Susanna, thank you
much.
very much indeed for chairing the event, and Edward, thank you very much indeed. It's been absolutely fascinating. I apologies for the yellow scribbles that appeared over your slides. At least they did on some people's screens. I have no idea why that happened.
I saw that. I just plowed on as a consummate professional.
Everything that I tried to do to get rid of them didn't work. So apologies for that.
No, not at all.
As regards the recording, what we will do is send an email to everybody who registered with a link to the recording. So they'll be able to get it on that. Now, just a few housekeeping points from the British Mexican Society. For those of you who are members or want to join as members, we have 3 events in the diary already. One is on the 4th of May, when we hope to be doing something to commemorate World Press Freedom Day. We did something last year that was very moving, very important. We actually entitled it, Why Are They Killing Us? Journalism in Mexico. And we thought we ought to follow that up because sadly the situation hasn't got any better. So members will be receiving information about that. Then on the 27th of June, we'll be having a very special gala reception with some VIPs along in London to celebrate the 80th birthday of the British Mexican Society. And that will be a very special event, and all members and their friends and guests will be invited. And then shortly after that, on the 6th of July, Circe Henestrosa will be giving a talk about Frida Kahlo's dresses and the rest of her wardrobe. Circe is the person who curated the Kahlo exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was very successful a few years ago. And she also curated one at the Kahlo Museum, I think it was, in Mexico City, also a few years ago. So do join the society. You'll get full details of these and other events. And it also gives you the opportunity of contributing to the small charities in Mexico, to which we've been able to give over £100,000 over the last 20 years, which is really quite significant. But let me finish by, first of all, reiterating my thanks to Susanna for chairing the event, and particular thanks to you, Edward. I'm so glad you were able to do this. It's been very, very interesting. I'm sure that those who haven't read your book will immediately go out and buy it. I mentioned at the beginning that the title, the cover looks different in the US and the UK, but it's the same book and it's available, as they say, from all good booksellers. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks, Edward.
Thank you.
Ciao.